if you're going to be discussing your beliefs with anybody, whether they're Christian, whether they're secular, whether they're Jewish, you're going to have a couple of things in place. One is you must know, especially if you're talking to a pastor, you must know the New Testament at least as well as they do. But even more importantly, they know what it says, but they don't know what it's saying. In other words, they don't know what it's talking about. And see, the reason that they don't know what the New Testament is saying, and I'm not trying to be offensive or insulting, is because you can't know what it's actually saying if you don't know what it's referring to, which is all on the other side of the book, on the left side of the book. Okay? So like, for example, when they talk about the gospel, they don't know what the gospel is because the gospel is the good news they'd all been waiting for since all the prophets were telling them of something that they were going to wait for. So if you don't know what was happening in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, the 5 books and all the prophets, if you don't know what's in the Tanakh, you can't really know what is being said by the Messiah and the apostles in the New Testament. You know the words that they said, and you can quote the verses that they said, but you won't know what they were really talking about. And that's where you get into trouble. And the reason that a rabbi can run circles around a lot of these pastors is because the rabbis know their Old Testament inside out, up and backwards and forwards, etc., because they don't study the way seminary-trained guys were taught to study. Because they're not just interested in the information. See, Christians are mostly taught about, let's learn the information in the New Testament. No, the rabbis are taught to get the information, then to understand what the information is talking about, what is it hinting at, what is buried underneath it, what are all the pieces and how they connect, on a whole different way than you're really being taught in the mainstream of Christianity. And so they've learned to connect dots. And so having somebody be able to connect up the dots for the Do You Know the Father and the Son teaching, I can see how that could help, because the rabbis are going to bring up, what about Isaiah 41 and 43 and 45, where it says, I'm Yahweh, your Savior, there is no other. Well, I promise you that no pastors can answer that question without the Do You Know the Father and the Son teaching. And by the way, is that what he used? Yeah. Because that's how we end up with a lot of believers ending up in Judaism, because they don't have answers for those verses in Isaiah and other places. And so that's why you need to have someone you can say, excuse me, let me go get my teacher. He can answer this one. Okay, because generally speaking, if you're a pastor going to sit down with a reasonably well-trained rabbi, you're bringing, a toothpick to a knife fight. Okay? I mean, you're just not ready for that. Because even the stuff you may be quoting out of the New Testament, they'll know what that's attempting to even quote and know that you have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea.
Yes, I would like you to please go back briefly, or please thoroughly explain the necessity of Genesis 15:18.
I didn't go to verse 15 in verse 18, and that's where it talks about the boundaries of the land. And I'm not going to get into that because that gets into more of, it has nothing to do with the teaching per se. The idea is that there's land that's about the promise, and we're following these promises into the prophecy. The actual knowing and understanding the physical boundaries gets more into an argument about the land the way it is today, whether Israel is actually covering the land properly, what nations are still occupying part of that land. That's not really part of the teaching. So it's peripheral to the point. The point is that the description of what that land looks like is in verse 18, and that's where it says, I've given this land to your seed from the river of Mitzrayim to the great river, to the river Euphrates, etc. And it goes through the names of the nations that are on that land at that time. And so I don't have more to say about it because I don't want to get into trying to lay that out with our geography today and all those other things, because it's actually peripheral to the teaching, if that makes sense. The important part is he promised that land to Avram and then his seed, and that promise is now, we're following the promise going down. And we're going to see that the promises have more than one aspect to it. We're going to see that there's an inheritance aspect to it, and there's a blessing aspect to it. So there's the physical part to it, and then there's the blessing aspect. And we're going to see these things actually separate at some point. The blessing of the the promise of the blessing versus the promise of the inheritance. And you'll see how these things split. So from that point of view, I don't have much more to say about that part of it. And by the way, I will confess and be totally honest with you, I have never studied out, because it just hasn't been relevant in my life for me to understand what those physical boundaries look like and which nations are encompassed in it, because that gets into all politics today. See, there's going to be our king coming, and he's going to put all the boundaries where they need to be. Until then, I don't need to worry about it. I don't need to let my emotions get all churned up because that country really is supposed to be part of Israel, and they're sitting. I don't need to get involved in that. Does that make sense? And I would encourage all of you, don't get involved in all of that. Nothing we do is going to change any of that till Yeshua comes and he changes it. And after all that goes for 1,000 years, none of that's even going to matter because he's going to wipe the whole thing out and start again with a new heaven and a new earth and all that others. So even that's not going to even matter because the new Jerusalem's going to come down. That's a whole different deal. So I don't spend a lot of time on that. But what's important in chapter 15, 18 is the reminder. He says, look, he's pointing out, and on that same day he says, look, I want you to know that this area from here to here and here to here and here to here, this is the land I'm talking about. So they knew and understood what the land looked like. Because previous to this, he had told Abraham, well, walk through here and walk through here, and everything you can see, that's it. Well, you can't see that far, but everything you can see and everything you travel on, that's it. So now he's actually giving the boundaries. So for those of you that are interested, and I thank you for bringing it up because maybe there are people that are interested, and I'm certainly saying nothing wrong with being interested. I'm just not, okay? And it's not because I'm better than you or anything. I'm just not interested, okay? It's neither here nor there. It's just neutral. But if you're interested, the boundaries are described here in verse 18, okay? And Ezekiel. Okay, so it's in Ezekiel as well. Okay? So you can certainly look into that if that's something that interests you. Okay, but I would caution you, if you study it and you start to realize what the boundaries really are and who's still sitting on some of that property, you could get emotional, and that is what I want you to avoid. Because now you're getting into the politics of it, and nothing that you get going on is going to change anything till Yeshua shows up. End of story with that whole thing. Hopefully we can agree on that. So if you want to study it, just don't let it get you upset, okay? Because it will. I mean, I'm not completely unfamiliar with it. That's why I'm telling you. It will get you upset, okay? Especially when you see all the fighting and all the stuff that's going on, when really Israel in itself today is much smaller than it's supposed to be, okay? It's supposed to take up a lot more space. And so if you're curious to see what that looks like, then just look at the boundaries laid out here and in Ezekiel, and then you can figure it out for yourself. Galatians that end of Galatians 3 is exactly the gospel. He said, here's some of the good news. You who believe in Messiah, who have put on Messiah, the good news is that you are now heirs of the promises to Abraham. That's the gospel. The gospel is not the gospel about Messiah, his life, his death, his resurrection. Although that is really good news. We don't want to ever minimize that. But the good news that he said to them to go out and preach was to let everybody know that not only is there going to be this regathering, which we haven't really talked about the scattering yet, but there's also the idea that all can be seeds of Abraham. And if you're seeds of Abraham, you're heirs of the promises. And so this is part of that. That's really what the good news is. Paul's sharing that good news at the end of Galatians 3.
What exactly does it mean when someone refers to themselves as Messianic? Do they still believe in the Messiah?
Actually, it's funny because you said that your friend had asked the question. I hope I'm not going to insult anybody here, but being me, I'm going to risk it anyway. She asked you because she was wondering if you believed in Messiah. I might turn around and ask my Christian friends who asked me that and say, I was wondering the same thing about you. Because if you believed in Messiah, he said, then you would do what he did and do what he said. So I wonder about you. So you may say, well, you know what? The more I've been studying, I'm actually wondering if you believe in Messiah. Put the shoe on the other foot, I mean, it's because seriously, they want to question you because you want to do the law. You want to keep the Torah. So do you still believe in Messiah? But you don't want to do the law and the Torah, so I wonder if you actually believe in Messiah. I'd flip it around. Yeah. Oh, she said she actually did that because she doesn't have the microphone. Well, that's good. I mean, I'm thinking, well, the more I study this, the more I'm wondering if when we were into Christianity, did we actually believe in Messiah? Now, we believed in the Father having a Son, and that the Son died and was buried and resurrected, etc., and is now sitting at the right hand. But do we really believe in him in the fullness of what it means to believe in him?
What about Romans 2:29? But a Yehudai who is he who is so inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in spirit, not literally, whose praise is not from men, but from Elohim.
Okay, first of all, we have to understand, I think I explained Romans in the heart of the matter somewhere. I think we covered Romans 2 or in one of the teachings. But let's understand that in Romans, what you have Paul doing is Paul's referring to circumcision and uncircumcision as a group of people, as his way of saying those born as native born and those not native born. Okay, so when he's talking about circumcision, when he says, but a Yehudite is he who is inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, he's saying just because you are of the circumcision, mean born that way, doesn't mean anything if you don't behave correctly. And so circumcision notwithstanding, it avails nothing if you haven't also had the circumcision of the heart. But by the way, whoever posted that on the live stream, bear in mind that circumcision of flesh and heart were both required at all times. We can go back to Leviticus and Deuteronomy and show you the verses that say that you need to circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Okay? So circumcision of heart is not a new concept. It doesn't change anything. But let's understand, to answer the question. This is a great question. Okay, you're reading the book of Romans. It's a letter to the Romans by Paul, and he's writing this letter. And as you're reading it, does Paul have the authority to change what we read in Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy? No, he doesn't. So to whoever wrote that, what was the name? Doesn't matter.
Yaakov Nazarite.
Okay, not Yaakov, and I mean this with all respect, but realize this. If Paul is saying anything that contradicts, undermines, or changes, adds, takes away, etc., then he's a heretic and needs to just be thrown out. So you really have two choices. Either he's a heretic and throw him out, or realize he may not be saying what you think he's saying. I prefer the second one, that he's not saying what most people think he's saying. Because he cannot be changing what... And by the way, Paul in Galatians 3 already endorsed what happened in Genesis. He said, look, you're seed of Abraham. If you're seed of Abraham, you got to get circumcised. And by the way, a lot of people miss this, and maybe they got to go back to the book of Acts. Paul was summoned in the book of Acts to Jerusalem to defend that he was not teaching against circumcision. He was there to defend that he was not. He didn't go there to say, well, I am teaching against it and you guys are all wrong and they don't need to do this. He never did any of that. He went there to defend that he was not teaching against circumcision. Paul is trying to make the point in Romans, though, that he says if an uncircumcised one watches over the Torah, if a circumcised one does this, for circumcision indeed profits you if you practice, he's talking about by birth. This is all his metaphor for talking about someone who's native born versus someone who's not native born. He happens to want to confuse us indirectly. I don't think he wanted to, but he confuses us because instead of just coming out and saying one who's born in and one who's not born in, he uses circumcision versus uncircumcision as his metaphors. It has nothing to do with whether ultimately you would get circumcised or not. He was simply saying when he refers to the circumcision in chapter 2, he says that he's referring to those who were born. In other words, on the 8th day, they had it done because they're already of Israel. They're Jewish. In this case, he's only dealing with Jews. And when he refers to those of the uncircumcision, those who were spent almost all of their life as Gentiles. And he's trying to say, look, being born one or the other, the whole point of chapter 2 is that it doesn't matter which one you were born. If you were born in and do nothing, you might as well have been born out. Your circumcision doesn't count for anything if you act like you were uncircumcised. And those of you that are uncircumcised, well then, if you go ahead and do the things you're supposed to do, then it gets credited to you as if you were circumcised. In other words, you get to be treated like a native born. But that doesn't change the fact that to be a native born treated, Exodus 12 tells you that once you're circumcised, you're treated as a native born. That's Exodus 12:49. And so this is really important that we understand that. I like Romans 2 because Romans 2 also has that verse that says that he's going to render according to our works. Everyone is going to be rendered according to our works, some everlasting life and some wrath and displeasure. And so that's in verse 6 and 7 in chapter 2 of Romans, which goes to show that what you do matters. It's not just about claiming you believe something. And that's Paul writing to you. So Paul believed in works. He didn't believe that works saved you. He believed that works affected your reward. Just like we read about Abraham, he says your reward is exceedingly great. Why? I'm going to reward you because you did this, this, and this and kept your part of the bargain. That merits a reward. That's a big attaboy from the Almighty. Hey, good job. Here's a reward. It wasn't because of lip service. It's because he did some things. Now, again, I know there's going to be a lot of debate over circumcision. I will do a whole teaching just on that, I promise you, okay? But let's understand, we have to be careful if we read something from Paul. Paul will tell you, I am the least of the apostles. I am the least. Why do we treat him like he's the greatest? Like he's above Moses and Abraham and everybody? Stop doing that. And I like Shaul. I do. I like his letters. I'm tired of arguing with people about them, but I like them. Okay? But we have to understand and embrace that while that is true, that I like him and everything else, it also means he cannot change, undermine, and override anything that came from before. We just can't. Okay? There's just no doing that.
How can a grown man get circumcised? And I thought, since that seems to be a lot of questions, maybe you can just address it.
Okay, our shamash usually carries a fairly sharp pocket knife with him to do it on the fly, just as needed. No, I'm kidding. The recommendation for all that, I get this question a lot. Okay, a lot of people think they want to go to the Jewish community and see if they could seek out a moel, which is what they call the moel, which is the guy who does it for the Jews. Generally speaking, they are not going to do it if you're not a Jew. If you're a believer in Messiah and all that, they're not going to come and circumcise you. I have recommended that, and it's worked very well for most people, is go to the pediatricians, find out who does the children on a regular basis, and some of them will do adults as well. But they're doing them all the time. That's who you want to do it. You don't want to have someone do it who does it like once a year or once every couple of years, but the person who's doing it for the children every week, because that's what they do. Okay? So go to the pediatricians, and that seems to be the best way to work it out.
Could you explain who the heir is that Yahweh is speaking of when he says, this one shall not be your heir?
Was it Genesis 15?
Yeah, I believe so. He put CHT, but I think it's Genesis 15, 3 and 4.
Right. Well, he's talking about Eliezer. He says Eliezer, who was not born of Avram and Sarai, was not going to be his heir. He said, because right now, basically what you would do is if you didn't actually have children, because he wasn't the only one having a childless, relationship, other people ended up with no children, and yet there was the law of inheritance. You had to give your stuff to somebody to take over the legacy, and so they would normally choose a child born in their house or one of their servants or someone to pass it on to. And so here he's saying, look, the only one that I have in my house is Eliezer. Okay, but Eliezer is of Damascus. He's not my seed. He's not. I didn't give birth to him. But this is my choice. Now he highly trusted him. We believe he's the one that he sent to go find a wife for his son, for Isaac. But he was not to be elevated now to actually being a son. But he would have gotten the inheritance if he never had another child. That's what Avram would have done. He would have given it to Eliezer, because that's his only other option. So hopefully that answers the question.
Is there some type and shadow for women without a covering to circumcise? And several people ask it in different ways. They're feeling like something's missing for them.
Okay, ladies do not have to do anything circumcision-wise, although there are some bizarre cults out there in some countries that are doing these kind of crazy things. But there's never been a verse requiring women to do anything like that, because understand that all Scripture refers to women as a part of their father, a part of their husband, a part of their family, like their older brothers or brothers. And so for the uncovered women, I've often said that the wisdom that I believe I was given was to explain that the uncovered can choose to come to the leadership in the ministry and ask to have that be their covering. Not automatically, but you ask. You come and say, would you be that covering? But then if they are covering, then you must come to them like you would normally go to your husband or father for guidance about the things that you would normally need someone to guide you on. Okay? The kind of questions in life that normally you would say, I probably should get, let me go ask my father, or let me go ask my husband. Well, if you don't have either of those, you need somebody to ask questions and seek counsel from, especially if you're going to make a commitment or a vow or something like that. You need someone who can annul it. Okay? Because you're going to go make these things and nobody to annul it, you're kind of stuck. Okay? So I would say that if you're uncovered, that you need to find a relationship with the ministry, whoever is your ministry that you're working with, and then seek and ask if they would be interested and willing to have that level of relationship to provide that covering. Okay? And that covering is purely counsel. No other husbandly duties are required or expected, and I promise you will never be provided. But we're talking about counsel and discernment, but also we're talking about possibly some correction and guidance from a corrective point of view, just like you might get from your father or your husband, okay? But that's the extent of it. I appreciate the questions. Hang in there. We've got a lot more parts to go through as we're kind of going. This originally was 4 parts, and we're going to easily get way past it this time because I'm trying to slow it down, break it down even more detailed than I did the first time. For those of you that really want to skip ahead and kind of read the back of the book before you read the whole story, there is a teaching online. It's actually, I got a bunch of them on the table here, called The Identity of Israel, Past, Present, and Future, which is the original teaching of this. And actually, it's the second time I did it. The original was from way, way back, and it was on audio tape, and I'm sure that there are some people out there that still have it. But anyway, so that's on the table. It's also online, and you can listen to it. It's pre-YouTube, so I don't know if it's on YouTube, but if it is, it's only audio. We didn't film in those days. I want you to really embrace Avram's approach. He trusted Yahweh enough to do what he said. Okay? Avram, by the way, you don't see him looking for verses or for anything else to say, yeah, but why do I really need to do that? See, that's what we're doing when we're trying to read into Paul's writings, ways not to do. Excuses not to do. One of the things I want us to understand when it comes to doing these things, it is my opinion. Always good to make sure you put those things in there like it's my opinion. This is my opinion that you are not likely to get in any trouble for doing more than you needed to. But you are very likely to get in trouble for not doing enough or not doing what you were supposed to. So better to do more than to do less. So if you need that piece of skin that much that you want to risk the kind of trouble you could be in, I don't think it's worth it. I just don't see how that could be worth it. Okay? Especially when it's linked to the covenant. It's not just linked to, some other little, hey, this is something I want you to do or not do. This is a covenantal sign. That's pretty critical. And I love the guys who want to use the Sabbath as a sign. They'll say, well, the Sabbath, it says that, the Sabbath is a sign between me and the people of Israel, the children of Israel forever, and blah, blah, blah. Why is that wording any different than the circumcision we just read as a sign of a covenant? Well, because I like the Sabbath. I don't like the circumcision thing. Nobody gave you a choice. I'm sorry. I have children. Many of you have children, and if you haven't, you've been children. And you remember, I don't know, sometimes my children will, I tell my children, well, we're going out to eat. And all of a sudden, I'll have all these opinions thrown at me, and I'll have to turn around and say, nobody asked you. Okay? When it comes to this, the scriptures, he isn't asking your opinion. Nobody asked you if you like it or not, if you want to do it or not. What he said to you was, if you want what I'm offering, this is what you got to do. That's what he's asking you. Do you want? He said to Moses, go ask the people if they want to listen to what I say. If they do, we got a deal. And such a deal. I mean, eternal life, everything. What could get better than that? Such a deal.
I had one thing thrown in late, and I just want to make sure we address it, because I'll tell you what I was typing in. But the question was about those who are circumcised at birth or as the infant. Isn't there a need later for them to have some kind of bloodletting? And I told them that no, every infant who is circumcised at some point in their life has to make a decision for themselves, and there's nothing in Scripture that says we have to go back and do anything again.
No. I mean, there are those that will do just a drawing of some blood and that kind of thing. I don't find any backing for that scripturally. And so I would say, no, if you're already circumcised, you're circumcised. But also realize that Paul is talking to you if you're circumcised from birth and you're walking around doing who knows what you're doing. So then your circumcision availed nothing. Just because you were part of that massive group of boys that was born, in the 60s and 70s that automatically got circumcised. Because they did it in the hospital on the first day automatically, and they still do that in some hospitals. That doesn't avail you anything in itself. Back in the day, it availed a lot. And actually, if you do this as an adult, it avails you a lot because you're making a very important decision and showing him a lot by choosing as an adult to go get it done. It was no effort on my part whatsoever to have it done on the 8th day. I don't remember it. I got a nice little pretty certificate that says it was done, that the rabbi gave my parents and my parents gave to me. And it sits in a file cabinet. It's not the kind of thing you hang on your wall. Oh, by the way, did you notice my certificate saying I got snipped on the 8th day? There it is, Okay. I'm just saying, it's not the kind of thing you have framed, But I have one. If anybody needs to see it, I got one. But the thing is, that was a covenant that my parents made to raise me a certain way. Okay? That was their commitment to raise me.